All right. You all may recognize our speaker tonight, but our speaker is Dr. Jaime Rogers, who is a recent graduate from the University of South Florida, where he received his PhD in applied anthropology. He is currently a principal investigator at the cultural resource management firm Search. He has authored or co-authored over 30 articles and reports. Jamie is also our president of the Central Gulf Coast Archaeological Society. Before I hand off this lecture to him tonight, I do want to remind us all that this will be the conclusion of our spring lecture series, but you may all look forward to rather than a CGCAS picnic this summer, we're going to be handing out more information on a CGCAS social. So with that in mind, I'm going to introduce the topic for tonight, From Harvest to Habitat, Oyster Harvesting, Shell Midden Formation, and Estuary Management in Tampa Bay, Florida. Jamie, if you would like to take over.
Yeah, well, thank you, Shannon, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. I appreciate your time. It's really nice being on this side of things for once, being the speaker instead of the person introducing the speaker. But I appreciate you being here, and as Shannon said, tonight I'll be talking to you about my dissertation research, which is about the relationships between people and oysters. We'll talk about um, the collection of oysters, the consumption of oysters, and the compilation of shells into middens and mounds, and what that means in terms of estuarine development and estuarine management in Tampa Bay. So, many of you are probably familiar with the Tampa Bay area, and you're probably in this photo right now. But Tampa Bay is Florida's largest open water estuary. There's four major rivers and about 100 or so tidal creeks that flow into the bay. They're bringing fresh water, mixing with the marine waters of the Gulf, and generating a diverse salinity gradient that contributes to a really diverse ecosystem of plant and animal life. And Tampa Bay is geologically unique because most estuaries in the United States are drowned river valleys, but Tampa Bay is instead this network of sinkholes. You can think of them as big and small sinkholes that have kind of morphed together over time. And they create a really unique landscape that contributes to some unique settlement patterns, and I'll talk about that in a bit. It also has a long human history. The earliest radiocarbon dates are about 10,000 years ago from the Harney Flat site in Tampa, but certainly wouldn't surprise me if that we get a lot earlier dates in the near future. Now, the Native Americans living in Florida and Tampa Bay 10,000 years ago are encountering a vastly different landscape than what we see today. This is, near the tail end of the last ice age. There's a lot of water and ice, and the Gulf was about 100 miles further out than it is today. And those sinkholes that I mentioned are filled with rainwater and springs, and they're more of a freshwater system, freshwater marshes, and they would have provided an oasis for people as well as animals, including megafauna, now extinct megafauna. And so a lot of people would have congregated near these types of areas. Now, following the ice age, temperatures are warming, ice is melting, and sea levels are rising, and eventually the Gulf starts mixing with these freshwater systems and generating the estuarine conditions that we know and love today. Right? And that happens between 5 and 6,000 years ago. So importantly, Native Americans were in Tampa Bay long before it was an estuary, at least 5,000 years. And so there is no, quote unquote, pristine or pre-human estuary. There's always been fishing and shellfishing and shoreline modifications happening in Tampa Bay. And what I mean by shoreline modifications, at least the most conspicuous evidence of it, is the deposition of shell into middens and mounds, shell monuments. Tampa Bay has some of the highest density of mounds in Florida and certainly had significantly higher numbers before development in the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries that destroyed a lot of these shell mounds. But there would have been dozens and dozens of mounds in Tampa Bay, and some of the largest mounds currently in Tampa Bay reach upwards of 13 meters and are estimated to contain several billions of oysters. And so you can see in profile here on the right, just kind of the density of shell that we often find in mounds and middens. And when we study the species composition of these features, what we typically find is oysters comprise somewhere between like 65 and 90% of the shellfish assemblage. So we know that oysters were very important to Native Americans, and some would call them a cultural keystone species. But oysters are really important to us today for a lot of reasons. They are ecosystem engineers. They provide a lot of essential environmental services. For example, they filter water through eating. They provide food and shelter for hundreds, if not thousands, of other animals. And they alleviate shoreline erosion, which is really important, when we face storms. Unfortunately, recent studies estimate that approximately 85% of the world's oyster reefs have vanished since the year 1900. And that's due to many things: climate change, overharvesting, pollution, dredging, just environmental degradation. But what that means is all of those essential ecosystem services are happening at significantly smaller scales than they were just a century ago. And that has a lot of cascading effects. For one reason, ecosystems are less healthy, and that has, ramifications for our economy. Fisheries play a major part in our national economy, and even though we often catch fish offshore in the Atlantic or in the Gulf, fish oftentimes grow up in estuaries and need these healthy estuaries to provide essential new nursery habitats. And so we need oysters for our economy, not only in fisheries, but also like the oyster aquaculture industry. And because they're also culinary staples for cultures all around the world. Today, people eat oysters all around the world. And when we look to the ancient past, or middens, what we find is people have been eating oysters all around the world for a very long time. Oysters are found in middens on both coasts of North and South America, in Australia, Japan, China, ancient Rome, throughout Europe, and Africa. And the middens in Africa are particularly interesting because some of them date upwards of about 150,000 years ago. And so, these are some of our earliest ancestors eating oysters, and some paleoanthropologists have hypothesized that oysters and other shellfish were vital to our biological evolution because they provide this really essential package of nutrients and amino acids and proteins, and they're important for brain development. And other anthropologists have also hypothesized that they were crucial to our migration out of Africa because they provided a reliable food source that was easy to exploit along the shoreline. People just kind of followed it out of Africa. And so, I don't have I don't know, whether those hypotheses are true. Paleoanthropology is pretty contentious, but I will say it just demonstrates that people have really long-lasting relationships with oysters, hundreds of thousands of years. Um, and so, yeah, it's pretty fascinating, the deep time relationships between oysters and people. Now, I knew I wanted to study oyster relationships between the relationships between people and oysters in the past as well as the present. And for me to understand kind of how people were interacting with oysters in the past and how archaeological data can contribute to some of these declines that we're observing, and how can archaeology fit into kind of solving these issues. For me, what I wanted to do was kind of get involved in the present. And so what I did was volunteer with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the FWC. They're responsible for managing oysters, creating the rules and regulations guiding their harvests. And I also volunteered with oyster farmers, which I want to talk a little bit more about. Now, I find that some people aren't familiar with oyster farms, but it's a kind of a thing taking over in Florida. When you go to a restaurant and order oysters, they're typically coming from farms rather than a wild reef. And so what farming is in this photo on the left in the background, you can see these floating bags. They're stuffed with oyster, and oysters just kind of float in the waves, slowly just eating and growing and growing. And periodically, the bags are taken out of the water and sent through this sifter. And that's what I'm doing in the photo on the left. And this is doing a few things. You can see there's holes in the sifter. If oysters are falling through, they're too small to go to the market, so they'll go back into the bags in their respective size cohorts. And the other thing it's doing is creating a more uniform shaped oyster. So as it's tumbling, it's kind of encouraging a teardrop shaped shell. And what it's doing too is encouraging a cuppier shell. And so as it's tumbling, it's creating little microfractures in the shell, encouraging the animal to repair itself. And in doing so, it's just becoming cuppier and cuppier. And this is a very similar process to when we go to the gym and we, do bicep curls. You kind of break down your muscles to build back stronger. And so that's what farmers are doing with oysters. And so they're really, it's a selective modification process, and you can't really get these types of oysters in the wild. They have to be engineered. And the reason that farmers are doing this is because that's what chefs want. And the reason chefs want these oysters is because that's what consumers want, right? So there's been studies where people are handed a plate of oysters and asked to rank them from most appealing to least, and people very consistently select this what's called a 3-2-1 oyster, an oyster that is 3 inches long, 2 inches wide, and 1 inch deep. So it's a 3-2-1 oyster. It's a thick teardrop shaped shell, and it's called the magical ratio by farmers. And so a lot of technology and a lot of time is spent basically engineering this type of oyster, and particularly compared to other shellfish like clams, which you can just bury in the sand and they'll be happy. And that's why some farmers in Tampa Bay have said that clams just want to be planted, but oysters want to be loved. The other thing I really took away from my time working with oyster farmers was the way they talked about the flavor profile of their oysters and how they relate it to the environment. So, Lost Coast Oysters describes their oysters as having a powerful briny punch followed by an earthy mineral finish. And the punch of brininess he attributes to the nearly marine waters at his farm, the minerals to the nutrient-rich waters that come and go in the basin, and the earthy finish, he says, results from the mangrove forests that surround his farm. And, I was a little embarrassed to admit that I thought oysters tasted more or less homogeneous, right? Just kind of a salty blob. But the more I researched this topic, the more I found support for what has been called oyster miroir. And that's the connection between the characteristics of oysters and the environmental and social contexts in which they are raised. You can go on any farmer's website or an oyster distributor and find a similar description. It's very intentionally progressive. It has taste, then texture, then finish, and it's oftentimes related to the natural environment because oysters get their flavor from the natural environment, their surroundings. And there's about 5 species of oysters that people eat today, and everyone agrees they taste vastly different. But most would agree the same oyster will taste different depending on the season you consume it. Oysters in cooler waters or in winter are typically a little sweeter because the animal is building up glycogen to deal with the colder waters. So there's differences in seasons, but there's some oyster harvesters in Apalachicola that claim they can taste an oyster and tell you the exact reef it came from. Because that's what happens when you spend your entire lifetime on the water. But Merroir is more than taste. It's also the social context associated with your consumption. It's the technologies that go into the experience. For example, oyster knives, right? They're very place-based. The blade, the handle, there's thick, thin, round, sharp, or thick, thin, The only thing that these blades really have in common is that they're very sharp, right? So these are very place-based and focused on the kinds of oysters that people are shucking in each region. Tongs, similarly, are also a place-based technology. The length of the tongs, the rivets, the angles of the tongs, these are all things that are very well adapted to the kinds of oysters that people are trying to get. And what tongers will say is that the feeling and sound of reverberations off the bay bottom is like listening to a musical instrument. And so, the feeling that they get, they compare it to music, and no doubt they know when they're listening to something good versus something that they don't even want to bother with, pulling up out of the water. So I find these two technologies really interesting. But for most of us today who aren't out there, tonging the waters or shucking oysters ourselves, our really only interaction with oysters is at a menu at a restaurant. And oyster appellations are oftentimes place-based, and they're intentionally done that way to metaphorically like transport you to that place. Because food is powerful, right? Anthropologists have studied food for a very long time, arguably one of the things that they've studied most in our history. And there's been a lot of papers on like the ability for food to have memories and to transport you through kind of time and space. And you can kind of think to yourself, like, is there a food that you can think of that transports you to a different time or place? So for me, when I eat orange slices, it brings me back to my time playing soccer as a kid. We would always get a bunch of orange slices at halftime. And so I always think about that and the powerful ability of food. It's a multidimensional experience. Now, I was writing an article and decided to take a break and watch the movie Ratatouille. And there's this scene where kind of the mean food critic takes a bite out of his ratatouille and his eyes widen and he drops the fork and he has this flashback to himself as a kid, his mom making him the same dish, and he kind of gets all warm and fuzzy inside. And this is just kind of an example from pop culture of the powerful ability of food. And yes, this is a movie about a rat that's a chef, admittedly crazy, but it just goes to show like it's not just anthropologists talking about this. It's kind of well received and kind of adapted in pop culture too. Food is powerful. And the reason I kind of bring all of this up right off the bat is because I'll be presenting data on oyster sizes and chemistry, species composition, and it's really easy to lose touch of all of these experiences that are embedded in the oysters. Each oyster that was harvested, is harvested for a reason. And it has memories and experiences, the technologies, all of that is kind of embedded in the oysters. And that's the way I think about it. And as an anthropologist, as an archaeologist, those were the kinds of things I wanted to unlock in my study. And so, getting kind of now into the archaeology, I wanted to investigate the differences in shellfish and specifically oyster harvesting between kind of midden and mound contexts, or what I call kind of the domestic and public sphere. Now, domestic harvesting, that's your day-to-day deposition. You're harvesting oysters for yourself or for your family, small groups, whereas the public would be these are mound building endeavors. We know from other archaeological research, these are events where a lot of people are coming from all over to participate in ceremonies, religious purposes, marriages, just building community cohesion. And we know that feasting is a big part of it. And we know archaeologically too that oyster feasting specifically, is a big part of it. And so that's what I wanted to investigate. And so I looked at two different areas in Tampa Bay. The first is in Cockroach Bay, about near Middle Tampa Bay in Ruskin. And the second was in Bishop Harbor near Lower Tampa Bay in Terracea State Park. And so these were the areas I was looking at. And I was kind of hypothesizing that I would expect a lot more variability in domestic harvesting because that's kind of just your day to day. I was expecting year-round harvesting. And if there are rules and regulations in place like we have today, I was expecting them to be a little more lax, in the domestic sphere when they because rules and regulations kind of they kind of you follow them consciously, subconsciously, but not necessarily if it's just for you grabbing a snack, right? But when it's a public event with hundreds of people and everyone knows the rules, you're probably going to follow them a little bit better. And so this kind of hypothesis is built from collective action theory, which is kind of more like economic theory than anthropological theory, although it's being a lot more adapted into anthropology recently. So that's kind of what I was hypothesizing and what I wanted to explore. And so I used a few different methods. The first on the left is a technique called stable isotope sclerochronology. And this is kind of the marine equivalent of dendrochronology. So trees, they grow in rings. So do shells. Shells grow incrementally and they like to live in equilibrium with the water. And so as they grow little by little, they're recording the environmental conditions that they live through. And so that allows us to then kind of sample, drill little bits from the shell. I used this same drill as my dentist that, to do cavities, drill out little bits, run it through a mass spec, and recreate the environmental conditions that the shell lived through. So this provides roughly a 3-year snapshot of environmental conditions, including water temperature and salinity are the most common. And so in that C, you can see two of those graphs. The one on the left is magnesium calcium. I produce that using a laser. And the one on the right is oxygen isotopes. I use that with the drill. And so you can see they have the same shape, the same profile. And so this is saying a few things. It's showing the seasonal variation that the oyster lived through. So we know that this oyster was probably about 2 years old. And using the trajectory of the water temperature, which is what you see in D, we can kind of relate those fluctuations to summers and winters. And so, tracking this shell, it goes down, so that's cooler, that's winter, and then it pops back up at the very end. So this shell was probably collected late winter, early spring. And so that's how we do that. And so when I compare middens and mounds this way, what I find are middens have oysters that were collected year round, every season. And when we compare mounds from both sites, it's winter dominant. Cockroach Bay, in fact, has basically exclusively winter oysters, whereas it's a little more variable in Harbor Key or in Bishop Harbor. But this is interesting because it really mirrors other studies that show similar relationships in oysters. So midden and mound comparisons in Crystal River, about 100 kilometers further north, show the same cool harvesting pattern in mounds, and as well as the Garden Patch site, which is further north in the Big Bend. But it's not kind of unanimous either, because there's also sites like Shell Mound in the Sewanee region that have migratory, or not migratory, they have juvenile birds, fledglings, that date to the summer solstice. And so not all mounds are being constructed exclusively during the winter, but it does seem to be a pattern in a lot of coastal sites. And certainly we need more proxies as well, other types of animals and things to look at more beyond, beyond oysters. We'll say in Tampa Bay, work by John Arthur and Charlene O'Donnell from Weeden Island, they have migratory birds that further support kind of a winter occupation in a lot of Tampa Bay sites. And so that's kind of the seasonal aspect and the difference. Now, they also indicate things like environmental variability. For example, the salinity that the oyster lived through. And when we see is middens are a little less variable actually. They reflect a higher salinity environment. So kind of going back to this map, I don't know if you can see my pointer. So this is Bishop Harbor. We see that oysters are probably being collected in the high salinity environment right here, right outside of the site. Whereas the mound oysters are more variable. And this could mean a few things. It could mean that oysters are coming from all over the place. Like these events were like BYOO to the feast, right? Or what I think is more likely is that they're coming from inside the subbasin because these have tidal creeks that are bringing fresh water in. And so there is a salinity gradient in these subbasins. And so that's what I think is happening with the oysters. I think the oysters from mounds are being intensively harvested in these subbasins, and the oysters for your day-to-day harvesting are being collected outside of these subbasins where there's like less control, less management happening. But the resources in the subbasin, easier to manage, easier to defend. So that's kind of why I'm leaning more towards that hypothesis. Now, I also compare differences in oysters and other shellfish. And what we find are mounds typically have less oysters than your day-to-day harvesting. And rather than oysters, they're kind of replaced with more gastropods and more non-oyster bivalves, specifically mussels. We find way more mussels in mounds than in middens, which is pretty interesting. And I'm not really sure why, other than, if you're trying to, excuse me, trying to mitigate your impact on oyster reefs, maybe, targeting a lot more mussel beds during these resource intensive events would be one way to kind of mitigate your impact to oysters. And I also measured a ton of shells to compare how size of those shift between public and domestic contexts. What I found was that there's really no difference in oysters, which I found very surprising. But there are more differences in gastropods, but it's not like a consistent pattern. There's more variability in domestic contexts in some cases, in public contexts in others. So how I interpret this is that oysters are consistently managed, whereas gastropods are probably managed a little less intensively. But I found the consistency in oysters something really, I found it really interesting and something I wanted to explore more. I wanted to think like, how selective were Native Americans being when it comes to harvesting oysters? And so I designed a study where I asked the FWC for oysters because they are harvesting wild oysters kind of randomly as part of monitoring. And so they have a data set of a few hundred oysters that's just randomness. And then I contacted my farmer friend to get oysters from their farm. Again, they're what I call hyper selective. They're trying to grow a 3-2-1 oyster, so we should expect not a lot of variability in there. So we have hyper selectivity and randomness. I wanted to explore where do archaeological oysters fall. So I compared 4 sites and 4 wild reefs and the farmed oysters. What I found is farmed oysters were the most consistent as expected. But what I didn't really expect was there was more variability within and between the wild reefs than there were the archaeological oysters. So the archaeological oysters, reflecting approximately 800 years of harvesting, were actually more consistent than the FWC was over 3 years of harvesting. And I found that really interesting. So what that means to me is that Native Americans in these areas were being very selective. It was targeting a small to medium, like a smaller medium oyster that's actually smaller, a lot smaller than the 3-inch oyster that the FWC kind of regulates today. And we find it consistently in 4 sites. Now, I also looked at the taphonomy of the shell. That's like things like parasitism and attachment scars, whether the parasitism is on the front or back of the shell. If it's on the interior of the shell, that means the shell was collected dead. Um, but I only found about 3% of the archaeological shells had evidence of being collected dead. And, that probably doesn't surprise you. Like, why would Native Americans be harvesting dead shells if they were going to eat them, right? But what that kind of gets at is the difference between bulk collection versus individual collection. Because oysters, they grow on these reefs, big clusters. And so one easy way would be to just take up a cluster. That's going to have big and small, live and dead oysters. That's not what we're seeing in middens. What we're seeing in middens is really an intentional focus on these specific individual oysters. And the one way that I think people are doing this, originally hypothesized by Jess Jenkins from UF, and is the practice of culling. And so this is like taking oyster clusters of oysters and breaking them gently with hammers, returning some to the water that are maybe too small and taking the ones you want. This is a practice that harvesters and farmers use today. Harvesters do it to comply with regulations. If an oyster is too small, you gotta put it back in the water. So you just kind of gently break it off. Farmers do it because, they don't want chefs don't want two oysters stuck together on their plate, so they kind of gently break them apart. When you're breaking apart an oyster, you can look at both and see where they were previously attached. They kind of cement to each other. And so when you break them apart, you can see the attachment scar on both shells. Now, when an oyster is broken apart and then it's replaced in the water, that attachment scar then becomes vulnerable to parasitism, things like sponge and worm. Now, if that oyster is then collected later on, like a year later or something, there might be parasitism on the attachment scar. The only way for that to happen is if oysters were broken apart and then returned to the water. And there are some natural processes that can do that, like other predators or storms can break apart oyster reefs. But we find it at such a scale and more than a few sites that I think archaeologists are beginning to treat this like it's real, it's an anthropogenic process, and it's culling. Now, approximately 20% of the oysters in my study had evidence of culling, and that's pretty high. And the reason that Native Americans are doing this is not only to be selective, but it's to mitigate their impacts on reefs, similar to the reason today. Because baby oysters need other oysters to attach to, and if they don't, they die. And so the only way to be sustainable is to maintain reef substrate, to keep oysters in the water. And so you can throw dead shells in there or bags of dead shells. That's currently what we're doing in Tampa Bay, among many other reasons. But it's one way to kind of mitigate the impacts. Now, speaking of kind of throwing, dead shell and other things in the water like riffraff and rocks, I do find in the archaeological assemblage, if you look at D and F, evidence of big quahog clams and limestone pieces that oysters are adhered to. And it's potentially what Native Americans are doing is kind of extending out reef substrate. We see this in other cultures, in ancient Japan, China, Rome, the Pacific Northwest, as well as Mesoamerica. And so it's not really crazy to think that it's happening in Florida too, but it is very difficult to prove. And I can't prove it yet, but we do find oysters attached to other things. So it could be happening. And I'll show you the other things in the attachment scars. A and B are these kind of long, linear, roundish features. These are from mangrove roots. And C is an imprint of a scallop shell. And so we know that now Native Americans are harvesting oysters from different environments, but still being really selective, really focused on this kind of like 50 millimeter sized oyster. So that to me led support for that there is like a selective process happening. Now, we know people are gathering millions, if not billions, of oysters and other shellfish to build shell monuments. And these are what we call infrastructure. estuarine infrastructure. And these are not kind of static features. They play a role in the development of the estuary, and they continue to play a role today, as we'll talk about. But archaeological sites in Tampa Bay, throughout Florida, really throughout the world, are being impacted by climate change, storms, sea level rise. Here's two examples from Florida. And this is really sad to see. A lot of cultural resources are being threatened, and there's a lot of great work happening on understanding the impacts of cultural resources by climate change. Similarly, natural resources, there's a lot of great work happening monitoring the ongoing and projected impacts of climate change on natural resources like wetlands. What I find is there's not a lot of research that integrates them, which is surprising because cultural and natural systems are really well integrated, and they share a lot of processes. They've been interacting for millennia. Why are they not more cohesively managed? And so that's what myself and my colleague Kendall Jackson wanted to explore. We see a lot of research happening about sea level rise at sites. A lot of it is GIS modeling, where you're kind of thinking about what are sites going to be like in 100 years or 200 years. They're going to be underwater. They're going to be destroyed. But we kind of wanted to take a step back and sit, not discounting sea level rise as a destructive process, but we want to better understand the process today because maybe it isn't always destructive, right? Because we find submerged sites all the time. There's clearly some that survive. What are those mechanisms? That's the kind of thing we wanted to explore in our study. And so what we did was look at the relationship between shell middens, sea level rise, storms, and migrating coastal wetlands in Upper Tampa Bay, which is just a beautiful part of the estuary. And here's some of our an overview of our methods. We document erosional scarps, we excavate, and we're in the intertidal zone, so we use a pump to kind of get below the water table. We screen in the bay, we take cores, and we document them and analyze all the sediment. And so I want to talk briefly about storms. So in this photo on the left, you see that yellow line. Down below the yellow line, you see kind of this black, what's called quote unquote black earth midden. It's high in organics and whole shell. It's clear as day in this photo. Above that, we have what we call storm redeposited midden. This is midden that's been kind of remodeled by hurricanes, probably more than one hurricane. So you can see it kind of clear as day in profile here. It's definitely not always that conspicuous. Like sometimes it is difficult to tell the difference. So I want to show you in this diagram, we're taking dates. We use a combination of different techniques to get dates, and we even have some historic storms for 1950 plus or minus 10. This aligns fairly well with Hurricane Donna. And so we're getting some cool historic storms as well as more ancient storms as well to study the kind of the impacts of storms on sites. Now, I mentioned it's not always easy to identify them, but if you look at on the far left, this is kind of a zoomed in picture of a core. And what you're looking at is actually two distinct hurricanes. So hurricanes are obviously high energy events. When the initial pulse of the storm comes, it's carrying a lot of big sediment, big shell, and it's kind of, pushing on the site. And as it, passes, energy is dissipating and you get less and less energy, that's smaller and smaller sediment on top of the site. And so what you're seeing is what we call a graded sequence of sediment. Big sediment on small sediment. Then you see another ground surface, and then you see the process again. Big sediment, small sediment, ground surface. And so in some cores, we're able to document multiple hurricanes. We're able to date them to figure out when they happened and kind of the impact that they had on the site. And sediment is one way we do this. The other way we can identify storm activity is through these little small tidal zone snails. Species like Seraph, periwinkle, Melampus, Marginella. These are found in way higher quantities in redeposited midden versus intact midden. Like people aren't collecting these. They work their way into middens sometimes, but they're not really like an economic species or anything. We find them from time to time. But in storm middens, you can see in these graphs, they're kind of off the charts. And the reason for this is because these critters are hanging in the mangroves or seagrass beds in front of the site. And as a storm surge pushes, it's dislodging all of them from their mangrove habitat and rapidly depositing them on the site. And so it's pushing the site, the intact portion of the site, further north or away from the shoreline. and it's replacing it with like medium sand and all of these little snails. And we know they're rapidly buried because a lot of them contain pigmentation. So they still have color, which means they weren't in the sun long. So we know they're buried fast, and in some cases, these have pretty significant impacts to sites. Now, this is a process that is known to absorb energy. We know this just based on like geological and oceanographic like laws. But one way we can measure this is through the difference in peat development in front of and behind the site. So in front of the site, we look to the in cores, we find really thin, shallow peat deposits with evidence of storm sediment. Behind the site, what we see is deep peat deposits with really no evidence of storm sediment. And the reason for this is because the site itself is absorbing that energy. And this is a process known as fetch. Or it's related to a process known as fetch, which is the unobstructed distance wind-driven waves traverse from their origin to where they break. I kind of envision it like kind of a tsunami that's just building and building. If it's not hitting anything, it's growing and growing and growing. But if it hits something, it zeroes out. Now, fetch is a term that was developed by Thomas Stevenson in the early 19th century, which was news to me because I thought it was Gretchen Wieners in 2004, Mean Girls quote for Rachel. But what we see is your day-to-day wave energy of her, your day-to-day wave and wind energy in the lower area of the bay is higher than it is in upper Tampa Bay. But with storms, it's kind of the reverse because of fetch. So some of the modeled waves in upper Tampa Bay are actually higher than they are in the lower areas of the bay. So these sites are actually taking a big brunt of the storm energy that's released in Tampa Bay. And you can see from this photo, this graph right here, this is a Hurricane Eta, was really a tropical storm or like a baby category one. And you can see the storm surge was at the apex of the site, but still no storm impacts behind it. So it really absorbed that. Now, coastal wetlands, marshes, seagrass beds, mangroves, they get really good PR for doing this, for attenuating wave, for attenuating wave and storm energy. There's a lot of good research and good science, and they deserve it, right? This is why we need them around. But shell middens don't get that. They don't get the same credit, and that's an issue. And so that this study is important because it shows like wait, shell middens are limiting fetch. They're attenuating wave energy, just like all of these coastal wetlands that get all the credit. And so they really work together, and shell middens are really protecting a lot of our shorelines today. The other really essential service that they're doing for us today is alleviating a process known as coastal squeeze. So coastal squeeze is when wetlands are seeking higher ground because they're trying to outpace sea level rise. But in urbanized estuaries like Tampa Bay, where the shoreline's developed, they have nowhere to go. And so they're squeezed to death. That's coastal squeeze. Now, sea level rise researchers have been critiqued as focusing too much on the erosion of seaward wetlands rather than the transformative abilities of more upland habitats. And so one area that's been really widely overlooked is shell middens. But what we've documented is that mangroves can and do encroach shell middens a lot in Tampa Bay and elsewhere in Florida. This is a process that probably is not surprising at all to Florida archaeologists, but it's not one that's really talked about. And there's a lot of great research recently on how mangroves are transgressing oyster reefs and basically replacing oyster reefs, but really similarly nothing on shell middens. And while oyster reefs are kind of shell dominant, they are really not directly analogous to shell middens. Shell middens kind of have bigger shells and a different type of sedimentary package. And so, it really wasn't completely known whether mangroves could encroach shell middens. And there was a study, an experiment done on the East Coast at the Turtle Mound site in Cape Canaveral, where researchers wanted to understand if baby mangroves, propagules, could recruit on shell middens. And they found sometimes they have a difficult time because large shells kind of block their roots. But they found that once, if if the mangrove does root, if it makes it to that, it actually becomes more resilient because the roots kind of anchor in to the shell midden. And so I think in the long run, it's actually more beneficial to the mangroves that grow in middens because they have more to hold on to during storm events and other things. And so we view this as a kind of a mutualistic relationship. Mangroves are benefiting from the high ground of shell middens, again, meters and meters of high ground that they can now survive on in areas where they would otherwise be squeezed to death. Middens are also benefiting from the deposition of mangrove peat. So peat is going on top of middens, and we think preserving it, at least in the short term. It's not being impacted by storms. It's not really being impacted by sea level rise yet, at least. And it wouldn't really surprise me when we talk about submerged sites. For example, CGCAS had a wonderful talk by Morgan Smith earlier this year. He talked about dozens and dozens of submerged sites in the Gulf of Mexico, shell middens just like this. And it really wouldn't surprise me if like mangroves are the piece of the puzzle. Like why do some sites survive and others don't? Maybe it's mangrove peat. We'll have to do more research to find out. But I will say, Kendall and I have cored dozens and dozens of mangrove islands, and it's never mangrove peat all the way down. Sometimes it's shell midden, sometimes it's oyster reef, sometimes it's marsh, but never mangrove all the way down. These are really dynamic and ever-changing environments. Now, the important part of this study was really just to demonstrate, like, hey, these natural and cultural systems are always interacting, right? We have the estuary program does an excellent job managing habitats, but they don't include shell middens in their habitat master plans because they aren't like your traditional habitat. But in reality, they kind of are. They meet the definition. They do a lot of habitat things. They're just kind of weird because they have all this other kind of intrinsic value to archaeologists and just descendant communities like the Seminole and to history buffs. But they functionally are habitats. They interact with mangroves and storms. And so a more cohesive management between them would really benefit everyone involved. And so I give a lot of credit to the Estuary program, who I think has come a long way involving archaeologists and the Seminole in these types of decisions. And so really happy to see that. And that was kind of talking more about like how archaeological sites are relevant to contemporary managers. And I want to kind of finish off by again talking about oysters and how like archaeological data can also plug in to estuary management in the present in a lot of ways, but I'm focusing on oysters. Now, as I mentioned earlier, globally, oysters have declined about 85%. There's been similar studies in Tampa Bay that have found a very similar value. Between 85 and 90% of Tampa Bay's oyster reefs have vanished since 1900. It's crazy to think about. There's some quotes that say Tampa Bay is the finest oyster ground on the continent. That quote is from 1868, I think, but just crazy to think about. Now, oyster managers along the Gulf Coast have lamented how little is known about oysters in the past. Other than these kind of quotes here and there, there's really not a lot of scientific data that goes back more than like 40 years. And so they really need this kind of data because in order to understand kind of where we're at today and where we're going to be in 50 or 100 years, it's really hard to do that. It's really hard to project where we're at today and where we're going to be. But when you have 2,000, 3,000 years of data that shows some sort of trajectory or how oysters respond to drought or storminess, like it's really easier to start modeling that. And so a lot of biologists and land managers have really began to really adopt archaeological data sets into their management plans, which is really great for us as archaeologists. Um, so what I wanted to investigate was how oyster size shifts through time and space in Tampa Bay. Oyster size is kind of a proxy for age and health, and so we can kind of think about how all of this changes. And I had 19 sample sites. 13 are archaeological sites, and 6 are modern reefs, just to kind of have a comparison. The the pre-Columbian shells are divided into four intervals, approximately 350 years and those align to kind of different climatic periods. We have like warm and wet, cool and dry. These can kind of help contextualize the changes. Period 5 is from the Garrison site from Fort Brooke, and so this is our historic Euro-American harvesting, and then period 6 is today. So you'll kind of see right off the bat, we have a huge drop in the maximum size of oysters, 9 centimeters, which is really crazy. And something you typically see maybe from like the best time ever in the estuary versus like usually today, like the oftentimes is the worst. And so, but to see this 9 centimeter loss in pre-Columbian times before like capitalism entered the scene is actually pretty crazy, and I don't think it has ever been documented before. Usually that sharp decline happens, when capitalism starts harvesting like literally everything. What we're seeing is a 9 centimeter loss before European colonialism. And so there's probably a few reasons for this, but let me kind of keep going for a second. Then we see some rebound. In period 5, we see a little rebound in maximum oyster size. And in fact, the maximum oyster size today is really only about 3 centimeters or so smaller than the maximum one we found in the archaeological site. But your average oyster, though, is a lot smaller. Your average oysters in the past are still bigger than the average oyster today. And so, kind of getting back to those ecosystem services, like ecosystem services were happening at much larger and much stronger scales than they are today. Like the ability to, be resilient against climate change and sea level rise for reefs, the ability to filter water and do all of those things are happening a lot less. But getting back a little bit to this pattern, which I know I'm kind of running a little bit out of time, but period 4 is during the Little Ice Age, which is this really prolonged arid interval. It's really dry, and oysters don't really do well in drought. But some of their predators do. Crown conch apparently love it. And so it could just be a time that oysters are super stressed out. Their predators aren't. It's also getting back to that kind of multi-dimensional experience, the miroir concept that I talked about earlier, it also kind of gets into all of these human elements, right? Because again, these do not reflect perfectly wild reefs. They are archaeological data sets. They were harvested for a reason. And so period 4, for example, the human element would be, this is during the Mississippian, we see a little more territories being carved out. So maybe there's stricter territories kind of limiting access to certain reefs. Similarly, period 5 is like at this kind of weird interval where it kind of like is right at the point where we start seeing really intensive harvesting. Like some of the worst periods of Tampa Bay come right after period 5, between 5 and 6. But between period 4 and 5, obviously, that's a very tumultuous time with colonialism. Native American communities are being displaced. And so there's just generally like less harvesting happening in period 4 and or after period 4. And so that might allow the natural system to kind of rebound. Similarly, like period 5, this is Euro-American harvesting. And what I've come to learn is like Europeans are not being selective at all when it comes to oyster harvesting. They're basically dredging everything and eating whatever they get. And so that really shows kind of the variability in oyster size there too. Period 5 has this really unique shape, and it's because it's really an unselective harvesting strategy. And so that's kind of playing into all of these differences here. And because Tampa Bay is Florida's largest estuary, like we want to compare oyster sizes at smaller timescales because each area of Tampa Bay has unique histories, right? There's a lot of shell dredging happening in Hillsborough Bay, for example. In Old Tampa Bay, that's where we see the most commercial harvesting, going from like 500,000 pounds to barren landscapes in a matter of 50 years, like a few decades, really. Um, so really, really interesting things. And this kind of method also kind of shows you your limitations in my data set, kind of the gaps that are missing and areas where we need to kind of plug in to find more oysters to kind of track this. But these kinds of data sets are useful for managers, and managers are now looking at them to kind of think about modeling the reactions to oysters in different historical and climatic conditions. So just to summarize really quickly, Oystering traditions reinforce connections to place, whether that's just through the act of consumption or the technologies. Indigenous shellfish harvesting was organized around place-based management systems, possibly reinforced through ceremonies. We see that through the difference in public and domestic contexts and the oysters we see. Shell middens are infrastructure that contribute to the resilience of the estuary. They buffer wave and wind energy. They provide vital substrate for migrating coastal wetlands. They are doing a lot of services and need the recognition that they do so. And archaeological data on oyster size alleviates problems with the shifting baseline syndrome and contextualizes ongoing management. So just understanding oyster sizes through time and not just looking at through the modern lens, like how have oysters changed over the last, 10 years, but how have they changed over 2,000 years? So, a lot of people to thank for this. My dissertation committee was excellent. Kendall Jackson helped so much with these all of these projects. Rachel helped with a lot of the field work. My wife, a lot of field school students, Estuary program, FWC, Terracea State Park, and everyone that gave me some money. NSF, Aware, FAS, FAC, Paleo West, and the Association for Environmental Archaeology. But I think I need to say some quote like, "These are my words, not theirs, so don't blame them if you hate it." But so thank you all, and I will open it up for some questions.
Anyone is welcome to share their question now. You can also pop that in the chat if you're more comfortable with that.
I have a question, Jamie. First of all, love the jokes, love the talk. Thank you. Um, so you were talking a little bit about culling, and I was wondering if you could tell me, it honestly might just be sh showing the slide again, but how specifically are you telling that an oyster is culled, and what percentage are you seeing at a site that makes you think it is like a purposeful management technique? And I ask because, as you know, I run the archaeology lab at Weeden Island, and we see a lot of oysters. So this is something I want to like keep an eye out for if I think we might be seeing this.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. So yeah, culling. So when oysters cement to one another, when you break them apart, you'll see their attachment scar where they were previously attached. Oftentimes it's like a centimeter. It's fairly small. Sometimes
Mhm.
it's even smaller. But you can typically notice it on most oysters. Now the idea is if they're broken apart and placed back in the water, those attachment scars would then maybe have either boring sponge or Polydora worms, the mudworms. And you can those look kind of similar, but there's really just like holes, like dots, like
Mhm.
maybe like 10 or 20 dots in this little attachment scar area. And it's because it's kind of like that area is a little more vulnerable, it's a little fresh. I think it's just easier for them to bore into. Um, and so when we see that, I just kind of mark it as positive. And in my study, it was about 20% of oysters had that. And I think that's pretty on par with what Jessica Jenkins found. I would have to find her study again, but I think it's a 2017 paper from the shell mound site. I think she finds pretty comparable, maybe even a little more than 20%. But
Okay.
she's the one that developed the method, and I think it's really ingenious. Um, and I don't like so in the natural system, I guess, I did compare briefly like the wild oysters and they didn't really have they had maybe like maybe 2 or 3%. Like it was really low.
Hmm.
So that just kind of lent more support for me that okay, maybe this isn't like a wild thing that's happening. It's anthropogenic. And I think more archaeologists are kind of on board. I think they were a little skeptical at first. Um, but also, the other thing I guess I forgot to mention was that these shell hammers we have are from manufactured from either crown conch or fighting conch. We find these by the dozens. Like my dissertation sites had hundreds of them. And so this is another thing that Jess Jenkins and Janessa Mahar related to the act of culling, because today people use little baby like ball peen hammers, and so these little hammers would do the trick. And I don't know what else they would really be for because they're so small. And even CB Moore, like back in the day, I think it was CB Moore, kind of said maybe these things are related to like opening oysters. And Marty Menz, one of Tom's students, did an experimental archaeology study comparing them and found it's probably similar, like maybe to open oysters or to kind of break them apart. And so I think there's more and more evidence for this happening in Tampa Bay. Yeah.
Cool. I found the paper. Thank you.
Awesome. Methods for inferring oyster mariculture on Florida's Gulf Coast,
Yep,
something like that.
that is exactly what it's titled.
I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering how exactly did you determine whether a given oyster was farmed publicly or privately?
How an oyster, whether an oyster was farmed publicly or privately.
Yeah.
So the farmed oysters in my study are all from one farm, and
Oh, sorry, I might have spoken wrong. I meant earlier when you were talking about the like public versus private
oh,
like oysters that you were looking at. How did you know whether an oyster was like obtained publicly or privately for that analysis?
gotcha. So I used um I used public and domestic as kind of analogous to midden and mound. So like a midden, I think of as more of like your day-to-day harvesting. It's like slow accumulation. There's more sediment buildup. Whereas mounded features, I mean, sometimes they're obvious, right? Like that's definitely a shell mound. But sometimes, like in the case of Cockroach Key, like there's kind of it's a blurry line. Like it's not a perfect dichotomy between midden and mound. But in some cases, it's like a feast where you see like probably a million of oysters with no sediment. They're rapidly deposited. That's more indicative of a feast versus like your day-to-day domestic. And so I use the terms domestic to reflect like your everyday midden type deposition and public as more like a public event that would have had dozens, maybe hundreds of people attending and feasting. And so, again, view that archaeologically as rapid deposition, which we know through radiocarbon dates, like shell taphonomy, not a lot of sediment. There's some other kind of methods that archaeologists have used in the past to kind of dichotomize it. But again, like midden and mound is not a perfect dichotomy. And in the published paper, the reviewer did want that disclaimer and more information on that. So that's funny that you point that out too. But did that answer your question?
That did. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And that public domestic paper just got posted online this morning. So it's in Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology, and you should be able to access it. And if not, if you want to email me, I'm happy to send it to you or anyone.
I'll look for that later. Thank you.
Mhm.
I have a brief question, which I'm not sure if you'll have the answer to, Jamie. But it was really interesting, your memoir discussion, and just thinking about too how I know in the world of wine, terroir is very protected, and so are appellations. Is that the same for oysters? Are those appellations protected, or is that just a social kind of code of conduct that people are following?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And yes, it's definitely like a play on terroir, like, and everyone kind of knows that process. Like wine derives its taste from the earth, the specific region. And so I think farmers were kind of co-opting that, and I think they want to make it as strong and defendable as the wine industry. I don't think they're there yet. But people are coming around, and there's even things like you can be like like certified as like an oyster sommelier now, and like there's all these things that are kind of I think building to that, and I think like there's more defense in like the names of
Mhm.
oysters rather than like the flavor profiles, but I think it's getting stronger and stronger, and may one day reach that level.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat, but I'll give us a last chance if anybody had anything else to add. Okay, it looks like there might not be. Well, thank you all for attending. We hope to see you at the CGCS social. And Jamie, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us and your jokes as well. I know that they were appreciated. And I hope everybody has a great night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shannon.